Sometimes the nastiest chapters in human history are best left unwritten. Human sacrifices of war captives, slaves, even children. Whoever committed these acts of violence had a flagrant disregard for human life. But did they go so far as to eat the flesh of their human victims? Winning the goodwill of the gods sometimes meant spilling a lot of blood. More than 2,000 years ago, in the heart of present-day Turkey, a terrible ritual. Men, women, and children sacrificed to seemingly insatiable gods, leaving behind clues to an ancient whodunit. A case of mass murder more than 2,000 years cold. Today, Gordian is home to only a few hundred farmers. But a few thousand years ago, it was the realm of King Midas, with his legendary touch of gold. Then there was Alexander the Great, who arrived at Gordian to cut the famous Gordian knot, sealing his fate as the conqueror of Asia. But there's a lot more to this place than the legacy of conquerors and kings. The soil conceals a mystery that would test the mettle of the most hardened homicide detective. And archaeologist Mary Voigt is about to take on the case.
One of the goals of the project was to look at the organization of an ancient city. We began to excavate in a part of the town which had been very, very poorly known.
So far they've been excavating the remains of King Midas' city and the Byzantine people who settled there later. But Mary's bumped into a whole other story along the way. Just beneath the surface lay the pieces of a gruesome puzzle.
And when we came down through the top meter or so of soil, we found this character. And we're not sure if it's a male or a female. It's about 16 years old.
A teenager without a body, not buried, but left to rot on the surface.
This one is broken, and so is this one. And it's broken in a way which, if you look at modern butchery practices on animals, what happens is if you partially sever the head and then twist it off, you get this kind of damage.
So the teenager was butchered, his head twisted off. Then the killers did something really disturbing.
He was stacked up on top of a dog bone, a dog skull, dog pelvis, a dog long bone, which is one of the femurs, and underneath all of that, like a big sandwich, was another pelvic bone from a human. We didn't expect this.
A deliberate arrangement of dog and human remains. This was no accident. Then up comes another human head. This skull comes with some clues.
This hole in a second skull was full of wood. So only the head that time, we don't have its lower jaw, on a stake.
A severed head with wood at the base of the skull means just one thing. It was stuck on a stake.
Headhunting is a relatively common phenomenon in ancient times, and it's usually honoring the enemy, somebody who's taken in battle.
Some of history's most notorious headhunters were the Celts, but they were in Europe, a long way from Asia. How could it have possibly been them? To find out who done it, Mary and her team have to figure out when it was done.
So the question is, can you establish when that land surface where the bodies are lying exists?
The key is to find something left on the same plane, something that can be dated. Then they get their wish. A small, unassuming piece of pottery gives them the answer they're looking for.
We were lucky in that with all the disarticulated bodies, the bone pile, the decapitated heads, we found a very distinctive kind of pottery with a decoration which can be securely dated to between 250 and 200 BC.
It is a big break. The broken pottery gives them a time period when the sacrifices occurred, as early as 250 BC. Now they have to figure out who was living at Gordion at the time. Not far from where the severed heads were discovered, they uncover more human remains. But these victims were not slaughtered for their skulls. It appears the killers weren't hunting heads. It was something much worse.
The bodies are complete. We have the heads, the whole skeletons, but they're lying in a group on a surface. They include both males and females. First of all, let's take this lady, who is an older woman, over 40. She, too, had a neck which was bent at about a V-shaped angle. That could have killed her, but the cause of death is this deep hole here, which you can, I think, see as a fracture. And then here, another large hole, and that hole caused cracks to go out in this direction, so fractured her skull. So she has a broken neck, she has skull fractures, and she's thrown down in a pit with 2 other people. One, a woman at the bottom who was laid with heavy, heavy grinding stones on top of her. Again, something we find in Celtic practices in Europe where stones will be laid on top of a body.
Another clue that points to the Celts.
At their feet, we found the body of a child, and this is its skull.
3 people. 2 women and a child, murdered and thrown in a pit. Then they find even more disturbing signs of a 4th.
In place was a lower jaw. Now, this bone is very fragile, so the upper bone is missing. But if you look at this, it didn't look right, even when we had it in place. It was placed like this in the ground.
Something's very wrong with this child's skull. It's got someone else's jaw.
This is a kid who's about 3, and this is a kid who's about 6. So they took a jawbone from one child and put it in place on the jaw of another, exactly the kind of rearrangement of human remains that we had in the other area of the site.
Even for a seasoned archaeologist, it's disturbing. Women and children sacrificed and thrown in a heap. The bones rearranged. A merciless massacre of the innocent. Who could have done such a thing? The human sacrifices discovered on the plains of Turkey had everything to do with supernatural beliefs. For Mary and her team, the evidence seems to point to the Celts, but can they convict them? The piece of pottery found earlier pinpoints a time when these murders were committed, between 200 and 250 BC. Around that time, remarkably similar human sacrifices were being performed in France and England, the dirty work of the Celts. The Celts were a loose collection of nomadic tribes linked by language, religion, and their lust for looting and war. They'd been marauding through Europe when in 300 BC they bumped into the Romans. The Celts marched into Rome and seized the city, not once, but twice. To Roman writer Diodorus, they were very strange. He wrote, "Their aspect is terrifying. They are very tall in stature, with rippling muscles under clear, white skin. Most content themselves with the weapons nature gave them. They go naked into battle." They were known as Galli in Latin and Keltoi in Greek, Gauls or Celts. Their affinity for collecting heads makes them prime suspects for the killings at Gordium. Mary believes she's on the trail of the killers, but can she prove that they were actually here, this far east in Asia? The team has opened another trench. This one's on the other side of the mound from where the human sacrifices were found. They've unearthed some intriguing artifacts.
It's rather crude, but you can, I think, see the eyebrows and the nose. There's a similar face on the other side. This kind of sculpture is found in Europe, and it's often associated with religious buildings. This was found outside our large building on the city mount, face down, like that.
It's astonishingly similar to a famous double-sided Celtic sculpture found in Northern Ireland, known as the Janus figure, a solid clue that the Celts may have been here. But the evidence that will clinch the case is still to come. They find a coin. But not just any coin. This one had a very unique purpose. It was specifically minted to pay Celtic mercenaries 2,000 years ago. Coins like these were a Celtic soldier's payday. For Mary, it's a breakthrough in the case. She now has her killers, and they are the Celts. Ancient texts back up the find. The earliest known Celtic settlement was in France. From there, they spread west to the British Isles, south to Spain, Italy, Greece, and around 200 BC, there was a mass migration of Celts into Turkey. As the story goes, the war-loving Celts were invited to Anatolia as mercenaries to fight on behalf of a king. They came in huge numbers, 20,000 strong. They called themselves the Galatai and settled at Gordium. Here they built a surprisingly refined civilization.
So I'm walking in the building, which was quite a surprise to us because we did not expect any large-scale formal architecture in what had been pictured as a very simple farming community. People lived here in some luxury. They have craftsmen out here who are producing textiles, figurines, wonderful pottery.
So the Celts, or Galatai, were here at Gordium. Mary and her team know who did it. As they dig into the evidence of what they did, they'll encounter horror on a whole new level. Bone specialist Jerry Dandoy studies the remains lifted from the lower town.
I was working in the lab, and somebody walked in the door and said, "Jerry, we need you out in the field." I said, "Why?" They said, "Well, we've uncovered something, and it's really strange because it's got a lot of animal stuff in it, and we think it's got some human stuff in it."
It isn't until Jerry sees it for himself that he realizes how strange it really is.
These bones were all mixed together. There was no rhyme or reason. Pieces all over the place. Everything was a mishmash.
They call it the bone pile, an innocuous name for one of the most disturbing finds yet.
We had over 2,000 bones, of which we were able to identify about 1,100 with a whole number of animals. We had sheep, we had goat, fox, horse, and we had 60-plus human fragments.
Butchered animals and humans found in the same bone pile. What does this mean?
I'm thinking, what do we have here? This is scary.
The pile bears eerie resemblance to the remains of a feast.
We have the remains of 3 people, a woman of about 35 to 39. So here is one of the female pelvic bones. What we've got from these people are skull fragments, a child's mandible, and pelvic bones. We have part of a male who was about 40 to 45, again his pelvis.
Human bones are all mixed with butchered food animals. The evidence leads to the question no one wants to ask. Did the Celts actually eat their victims? In the lab, Jerry nails down a clue that supports the case for cannibalism. The bones reveal important evidence of when the slaughter occurred. Some of the sacrificed animals from the pile are very young.
The scapula is our shoulder blade. It's right back there on us, and approximately the same place on a sheep. And this little part right here was unfused. That meant that that animal, in fact there were 2 of them, were at the very oldest 8 months and more than likely less than 6 months old.
This gives them an accurate time of year when the sacrifices took place.
Since sheep are normally born in the spring, these animals were killed sometime in the fall. October, November, something like that.
In ancient Celtic culture, that's when they held one of their most important religious ceremonies. It was known as Samhain, a precursor to our modern Halloween. A magical time when the veil was lifted between the mortal world and the afterlife, and the dead walked among the living. One of the main features of the festival, a huge feast. These rituals were always conducted by the Druids, the very mysterious spiritual leaders of the Celts. They had complex rituals for divining the future, involving human sacrifice and the rearrangement of bones, exactly what Mary and her team uncovered at Gordian. The Druids never wrote about their religious rituals, so most of their secrets died with them. But the ancient Greeks did take some notes. They would strike a man who had been consecrated for sacrifice in the back with a sword and make prophecies based on his death spasm. And Julius Caesar had his own issues with the Druids. They even go so low as to inflict punishment on the innocent. For Mary and her team, all roads lead to a head-on collision with Celtic historians. The Celts may have been ruthless, but were they actually cannibals?
If we just had the animal bone, if there were no humans there, we would say, and no one would hesitate to say it was food debris. And there's a lot of meat animal, all the domestic animals used for food at the site are in this deposit. So I think we sort of left it there, but cannibalism, the word cannibalism came up, and our European colleagues are very upset by this. But I found in my old age that I'm a risk taker.
For Jerry, walking around the Celtic refuse pile summons up this bloody chapter of human history.
We don't treat people like the way I saw people being treated in here, pieces of them. unless you're in a war zone, and even then you don't have that kind of dismemberment. That upset me. But from the scientific perspective, from the anthropological perspective, I said, I need to know what happened here.
In the end, if these human sacrifices and probable acts of cannibalism were intended to divine the future, it didn't work. Not long after, in 189 BC, a Roman general launched a surprise attack on the Galatai. The Galatai dropped everything and fled to the mountains. The Romans followed. And slaughtered them. Payback for centuries of raiding in Europe and Asia. 2,000 years later, the chilling legacy of human sacrifice still haunts the hills of Gordian. And while Celtic historians would argue against Mary's findings, she stands by her story, that the Celts at Gordian, the fearsome Galatai, not only performed human sacrifice, but may well have eaten their human victims.
I couldn't find a better explanation, and I would be happy to have somebody suggest how to account for what we found.